In 1869, in the bleak farmland of Ash Hollow, Ohio, withered cornfields and collapsing barns were no longer the most frightening sights for its people. Whispers began to spread about a strange gathering at the edge of town, where fog covered the meadows and eerie songs echoed at night. They weren't hymns of praise, no. They were warped melodies, half chant, half moan, more like mourning than prayer. The people of Ash Hollow called them the songs of the deformed. And soon they would learn that those haunting voices came from a sect unlike any their town had ever known. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing, because what you're about to hear is a story buried beneath dust and silence, a tale Ohio never wanted remembered. And before we descend further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there now? At the heart of these rumors was a man no one in town had seen before. He arrived on a stormy night, riding a skeletal horse, dragging behind him a rotting wooden trunk. He introduced himself as Malachi Thorne, a preacher. He claimed, sent from nowhere in particular. But his message was unlike any the town had ever heard. Salvation, he whispered, could only be achieved through suffering and physical deformity. At first, his words were little more than tavern talk, carried into the dim-lit room of Ephraim Caldwell's roadside inn. Caldwell had seen his share of drifters, drunkards, and snake oil prophets, but Thorne did not beg for food or coin. He fixed his hollow eyes on the weathered faces of the locals and spoke of a God not perfect, a God scarred and broken. Some spat at the blasphemy. Others, already broken by grief or poverty, found in it a strange comfort. One of the first to fall under his spell was Silas Quill, a gaunt man who lived on the edges of town. Silas bore a reputation for violence, a man whose hands had once been stained red in a fight gone too far. They said he had killed a thief in the woods, though no one dared ask him directly. Now, Silas listened to Malachi's sermons like a starving man to food. He became the preacher's shadow, repeating his words, nodding when Thorne described the blessing of imperfection. Others followed. Temperance Blythe, a widow who had buried 3 children in the last fever epidemic, clung to Thorne's twisted gospel. He told her that the weak and misshapen were chosen, that her children had not been cursed, but marked. Obadiah Crane, a limping veteran of the Civil War, came too. He believed his shattered leg was no longer shame, but proof of divine favor. In the beginning, their meetings were hidden. They gathered in Caldwell's abandoned hayloft, where candles flickered against rough wooden beams. Those passing by heard muffled prayers that turned into cries, then laughter that chilled the bone. Prudence Harker, the village midwife, swore she once saw a woman carve a gash across her cheek during one of their gatherings, while others reached out as if the spilling blood was holy water. The townsfolk, for the most part, dismissed them as lunatics. Rural Ohio had always known its share of fire and brimstone preachers, self-proclaimed prophets, and fanatics. What made Thorne's sect different, however, was its exclusivity. They did not cast their net wide. Instead, they drew in only those whose souls were already fractured, the grief-stricken, the crippled, the outcast. One stormy summer night, Thorne preached as thunder cracked the sky. His thin frame was lit by flashes of lightning as he raised his voice above the roar, "God is not whole. God is broken. And only when we carry that brokenness in our own flesh can we ever be saved." His words sliced through the storm. Silas Quill echoed them aloud, trembling. Temperance Blythe collapsed in sobs. Obadiah Crane pressed his mangled leg to the floorboards and swore his suffering would now be his offering. From that night forward, Ash Hollow would never know peace again. Villagers spoke of candles burning through the night in Caldwell's loft, never snuffing out. They claimed children dreamed of twisted figures watching through their windows, and slowly people began to vanish. A servant girl named Eliza Morton left her employer's farm, declaring she had found a new light. She was never seen again. A poor farmer, Jonah Fitch, sold his last cattle and walked away to join the sect. By autumn, the group had grown too large, too fervent for a hayloft. They pooled their meager resources, and, with Thorne's urging, they bought a stretch of abandoned land beyond the oak woods, where the fog lay heavy and the soil seemed always damp. There, they built their sanctuary. They called it the Hollow Fields, and from that cursed ground, the darkness truly began to spread. Malachi Thorne's arrival in Ash Hollow did not seem significant at first. Travelers often passed through the region, peddlers, drifters, veterans wandering after the war. But, unlike others, Malachi did not move on. He lingered, as if the soil itself had chosen him, in taverns and in barns, in whispers and in sermons. He planted ideas that unsettled even the strongest minds. He had the look of a man who had endured famine and fever. His cheeks were hollow, his coat threadbare, his eyes sunken yet strangely radiant. When he spoke, there was no thunder in his voice, no theatrics, only a quiet intensity that made listeners lean closer. And what he preached was unlike any gospel heard before. Perfection is a lie, he would murmur to farmers resting from their plows. It is not in wholeness that God dwells, but in fracture. The scar is holy. The broken limb is nearer to heaven than the unblemished. Some scoffed. Others walked away. Yet a handful stayed behind after the crowds dispersed, asking questions they never dared to voice before. They had lived with shame of bodies twisted by accident, shame of children born weak, shame of grief that had no answer. And now Thorne's words gave that shame a sacred name. The first to kneel before him was Silas Quill. Silas had always been a shadow among men, a figure people avoided in the streets. He worked odd jobs when sober, and vanished into the woods when not. Violence followed him like a curse once. He had beaten a thief half to death in front of a crowd. Most men would have been jailed or lynched. Silas survived, though he was never trusted again. But Thorne spoke to him as though he were chosen. He told Silas that his rage, his scars, his isolation were not burdens, but gifts. "You have been marked," Malachi whispered, "as one of God's broken mirrors. You do not reflect him as he is imagined, but as he truly is." From that moment, Silas became inseparable from the preacher, his shadow, his echo. The second was Temperance Blythe. She had once been admired in Ash Hollow for her beauty and her voice in the church choir. But fever had swept her household, taking all three of her children in one bitter winter. Her husband followed them soon after, his spirit broken. Temperance withdrew from the world, her hair streaked white at the temples, though she was still young. When she heard Thorne speak of children born sick and frail as heaven's true offerings, she wept openly. He told her that her children had not been punished by disease, but lifted up as chosen ones. He promised that their suffering was not meaningless, that they had carried the mark of God's fractured love. To Temperance, those words were salvation. She became Thorne's most devoted voice, singing his twisted hymns with a fervor that unsettled even his other followers. The third was Obadiah Crane, once a soldier. He had marched under the Union banner, but war had left him with a mangled leg and a mind haunted by fields of the dead. He hobbled through life with a crutch, living in his sister's attic, pitied by neighbors who whispered he should have died on the battlefield. When Thorne saw him, he placed a hand on Obadiah's ruined limb and declared, "This is not a wound. It is a seal. The Lord has written his covenant upon your flesh." For the first time since the war, Obadiah lifted his head, believing he had been chosen not in spite of his brokenness, but because of it. By autumn, the three had become pillars of the sect. Silas was the enforcer, silent and watchful. Temperance was the voice, carrying Thorne's words to women and widows alike. Obadiah was the testimony, limping proof of suffering made sacred. The gatherings grew bolder. Where once they had hidden in barns, they now met openly in fields at night, their candles forming circles that glowed like strange constellations. Farmers passing by whispered that the sound of their chants did not resemble prayer, but lamentation. The words were unfamiliar, half scripture, half invention. Glory to the God of fractures, they sang. Blessed are the broken, for they shall be his likeness. Ash Hollow began to divide. Some saw Thorne as a dangerous heretic who preyed upon grief. Others, quietly suffering, wondered if perhaps there was truth in his words. The village midwife, Prudence Harker, noticed a change in the women. Widows who had once kept silent now gathered around Temperance. Mothers who had lost children lit candles and left them at the edge of the woods. It was Ephraim Caldwell, the tavern keeper, who first confronted Thorne. "You preach blasphemy," he said, "and you draw the weak into madness." Malachi only smiled. "I draw them into truth," he replied, his voice calm. "And truth has always been called madness by those who fear it." Caldwell spat on the ground and swore he would never serve him another drink. But by then, Thorne did not need the tavern. His flock was growing, and they gave him more than food or coin, they gave him faith. The nights grew darker. Stories spread of strange rites in the hayloft, of scars carved deliberately into flesh. A young girl claimed she'd saw Silas Quill cut his own palm and smear the blood across his chest in the shape of a crooked cross. Another whispered that Temperance Blythe had burned her face with a candle flame, smiling as she called the pain holy. By the time winter arrived, Thorne no longer needed to persuade. His followers sought suffering on their own, desperate to bear the mark of salvation. And Ash Hollow, though silent on the surface, it was beginning to tremble beneath the weight of something it could not yet name. The Hollow Fields began as nothing more than a patch of neglected farmland, a stretch of damp earth where oak roots clawed up from the soil and fog seemed to settle like a second skin. Locals had long avoided it. The ground was poor, the air heavy with mildew, and strange sinkholes appeared after every rain. For most farmers, it was worthless. But to Malachi Thorne and his growing sect, it was holy ground, a land already broken, fit for the broken, as he called it. With coins pooled from widows, veterans, and drifters, they purchased the deed. The village clerk, uneasy but eager for the money, signed the papers without question. By late winter of 1869, wagons, loaded with salvaged wood and rusted nails, creaked down the muddy road to the property. And soon, a settlement began to rise from the mist. At its center was a weathered farmhouse, its walls patched with mismatched planks, the roof sagging under tarred cloth. Around it stood smaller shacks, little more than one-room hovels where families huddled close to keep warm. They named it simply the Hollow Fields, though some whispered Thorne had another name for it, Sanctuary of the Fractured Light. Life there was harsh by design. Malachi preached that comfort was the enemy of salvation. Food was plain-boiled roots, scraps of cornmeal, and the occasional thin broth. Meat was rare, eaten only after long fasts, when bodies shook with hunger and eyes glazed with visions. Warmth was denied, fires were kept low, blankets few. To feel the cold is to feel the kiss of God, Thorne told them, and his followers obeyed. Silas Quill oversaw the work with an iron hand, enforcing Malachi's commands. It was Silas who rationed the food, who decided when fasts would end, who dragged latecomers out of bed to join the midnight prayers. He patrolled the farmstead like a sentinel, his shadow cast long by the lantern flames. Children feared his gaunt figure. Yet some whispered he was blessed because pain never seemed to break him. Temperance Blythe, once a woman broken by grief, now thrived in her strange role. She gathered the women at night, teaching them hymns Thorne claimed had been whispered by angels scarred and bent. Her voice rose through the darkness, mournful and piercing, carrying across the fields to the distant village. Farmers working late swore they heard her chants on the wind, though no church bell called the hour. Obadiah Crane became a living icon within the sect, limping across the fields, leaning on his crutch. He spoke to the children about how his leg had been shattered in war and how the Lord had chosen him through that wound. They touched the scar tissue as though it were a relic, and Obadiah bore their reverence with solemn pride. To outsiders, he looked pitiable. To those within, he was proof that broken flesh was divine. Among the new recruits was Mercy Elwood, a farm girl who had fled a cruel stepfather. Her body bore bruises and scars not from faith, but from violence. Malachi placed his hand on her brow and declared that she was already sanctified by suffering. Mercy followed him thereafter with unwavering devotion, whispering prayers as she carried water buckets heavier than her thin frame could bear. There was also Jonah Fitch, a young man who had sold his last livestock to join. He toiled in the fields with desperate fervor, convinced each blister on his hands was another step toward grace. He and others worked the land not for harvest, few crops ever grew, but as a ritual, turning soil that refused to yield, as though tilling the earth's wounds would mirror their own. By spring, rituals in Hollow Fields grew darker. At night, the barn became their chapel. Inside, lanterns were extinguished until only the faintest glow of moonlight filtered through cracks in the boards. The air smelled of mold and sweat. Followers knelt on straw, reciting verses written in Thorne's jagged script. Blessed are the crooked bones, for they shall point heavenward. Blessed are the scarred hands, for they shall hold eternity. On certain nights, silence would fall, broken only by the sound of flesh meeting blade. A shallow cut across an arm, a burn from a candle held too long. Thorne told them it was not mutilation, but revelation, each mark another crack through which God's fractured light could shine. Prudence Harker, the midwife who often passed near the farm, told of hearing cries in the night, not the cries of labor or illness, but something stranger voices lifted together, half in agony, half in ecstasy. She claimed she once saw a procession winding through the fog, their faces hidden, their arms streaked with blood that gleamed like silver in the moonlight. At the head walked Malachi, his pale face radiant, Silas Quill at his side. Yet for all its horror, there was a pull to Hollow Fields. Outcasts who had no place in Ash Hollow drifted toward it like moths to a flame. They said life there was harsh, but they also said it gave them meaning. Where the world had called them crippled, cursed, or damned, Thorne called them chosen, and for many, that word alone was worth the suffering. But to the townsfolk, a different word whispered through the taverns and over fences cult. They watched with unease as wagons disappeared down the foggy road, as women stopped attending the village church, as men left their farms untended. Caldwell muttered that the sect was poisoning the land itself. Ephraim was not alone. Fear was spreading. Still, Thorne smiled. The world will hate us, he told his flock one night, his voice soft and steady. It hated him first. Let them call us heretics. Let them call us mad. They cannot see the light that shines only through the broken glass. And the followers of Hollow Fields, scarred, starving, yet strangely serene, answered as one amen. By the summer of 1869, the Hollow Fields Sect was no longer just a gathering of outcasts, it had become a world of its own, ruled by the voice of Malachi Thorne. His followers called him the Shepherd of Fractures, a title he never denied. And his sermons grew darker, moving beyond words of comfort for the broken to commands that demanded the body itself become the altar of devotion. They gathered in the barn, packed tight upon the straw, the smell of sweat, blood, and mildew hanging in the air. The windows were boarded, the lanterns extinguished, until only a single candle remained at the center. Thorne would stand beside it, his shadow rising long across the wall, his pale face half lit in the flickering flame. "The body," he whispered, "is a false idol when whole. Wholeness is pride. Wholeness is rebellion. But when the flesh is scarred, when the bone is crooked, then the soul shines through. Only the broken mirror reflects God's true face." The congregation would murmur in agreement, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. Temperance Blythe, once hollow with grief, now burned with zeal. She lifted her sleeve to show a circle of scars, thin white lines cut into her arm. "Each mark," she declared to the women gathered, "is a hymn carved in flesh." They wept with her, some from horror, others from longing. Silas Quill enforced Thorne's doctrine with silent obedience. When new recruits wavered, Silas was the one who brought the blade, pressing it into trembling hands. "He does not demand more than you can give," Silas would say in his low rasp, "only enough to show your faith." Few resisted. Those who did found themselves watched by Silas's hollow stare until shame broke them. Children, too, were drawn into the doctrine. Small cuts on their palms, a burn from a candle flame, they were told it was a kiss from heaven. Obadiah Crane limped among them like a saint, urging them to see his twisted leg as proof that God's light lived in deformity. Little Nathaniel Blythe traced his fingers along Obadiah's scarred knee as if it were scripture, whispering, "I want to be chosen too." But not all were convinced. From the village, rumors spread like wildfire. Prudence Harker, the midwife, heard stories of mothers refusing to treat their children's fevers, believing illness itself was sanctification. Ephraim Caldwell swore he saw Temperance lead a line of women through the fields at midnight, their arms streaked with blood, their faces lifted to the sky as if waiting for angels that never came. Even those with sympathy for the sect felt a chill when they spoke of it. "They believe suffering is salvation," muttered Dr. Josiah Fenwick, shaking his head. "And what man who believes such a thing will ever let his suffering end inside Hollow Fields?" Thorne's words tightened around his flock like a noose. Fasting grew longer. Nights of prayer stretched until dawn. And always the command lingered, "Break the body," that the soul might shine. Mercy Elwood bore it with quiet devotion. Her thin arms were cross-hatched with scars, but she never faltered. She said her pain had a purpose, that each line was a letter in the holy language of God. Jonah Fitch, desperate for meaning, walked barefoot over thorns until his feet bled, convinced the agony would open the gates of heaven. One night, the doctrine reached its most terrible moment. Malachi stood at the center of the barn, candlelight catching the sharp edge of a knife in his hand. "This is not mutilation," he told them softly. "This is revelation. The flesh is a curtain, and we must tear it for the light to come through." He pressed the blade against his forearm, slicing a thin, deliberate line. Blood welled up, glistening red-black in the dim glow. Gasps filled the barn, but no one moved. Thorne smiled faintly and held his arm out, letting drops fall onto the dirt floor. "Do not fear the wound," he whispered. "Fear only the wholeness that hides God's face." Temperance Blythe stepped forward first, tears streaming, and repeated the act, her voice trembling as she cried out a hymn. Silas followed, then Obadiah. Then one by one the congregation came forward, each leaving a mark upon their flesh as though signing their names into the covenant of pain. By dawn, the barn reeked of blood and sweat. Bandages of torn cloth wrapped their arms and hands. Yet their faces shone with a serenity that unnerved even themselves. "We are nearer now," Malachi said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "Nearer than the world will ever know. But outside, in Ash Hollow, the townsfolk had begun to see. More and more they found children pale and fevered, mothers bearing wounds they could not explain. Sheriff Edwin Blackwood heard whispers of graves dug shallow in the woods, though none dared confirm. The line between ritual and madness was blurring. And though Hollow Fields remained hidden in the fog, the doctrine of the broken body was spreading, seeping like rot through the bones of Ohio. By autumn of 1869, Hollow Fields had taken on a new focus. If scars and broken bones were signs of divine favor in adults, then what greater proof could there be than children, those untouched by the world, their bodies still pliant, their futures unwritten? Malachi Thorne began to speak of them not merely as members of the sect, but as vessels of heaven itself. "The child," he whispered in his hushed sermons, "is the blank page upon which God writes most clearly. And when that page bears his fracture, his mark of deformity, then we see his scripture in flesh." At first, the words seemed innocent enough. Parents nodded, clutching their children closer, believing their little ones were especially blessed. But soon, the doctrine darkened. Sickness and weakness were no longer feared. They were celebrated. Mothers whispered that fevers were baptisms of fire, that twisted limbs were crowns of glory. Some even prayed for frailty in the womb, believing that deformity at birth was proof of God's hand on eye. Temperance Blythe became the most fervent in this belief. Having lost her children to disease, she saw their deaths not as tragedy, but as sacrifice. She began to urge women to see illness not as an enemy, but as a messenger. "Do not beg for their recovery," she told grieving mothers. "Beg that their suffering be sanctified." Among the children at Hollow Fields, 2 stood out. Little Nathaniel Blythe, Temperance's only surviving son, was pale and often ill, his body thin and frail. His mother called him her living hymn. And Charity Crane, daughter of Obadiah, bore a twisted spine that forced her to walk bent. Within the sect, these children were adored, lifted up as examples of God's chosen. Outsiders, however, saw only sickness and cruelty. Stories began to spread beyond the fog. Prudence Harker, the midwife, claimed she had been summoned for a birth at Hollow Fields, only to be turned away at the door by Silas Quill. Through the cracked shutters she heard the muffled wails of a newborn, followed by chanting voices. The next day, there was no sign of the child. She demanded answers, but none were given. Days later, she swore she saw a fresh mound of earth behind the barn, a tiny grave unmarked by stone or name. Dr. Josiah Fenwick grew alarmed as more parents in Ash Hollow refused his care. He heard whispers that medicines interfered with God's plan, that healing was a form of rebellion. Once, when he visited Hollow Fields, Silas barred his way, saying, "The children are not yours to mend. They are already perfect in their brokenness." Fenwick left in fury, but unease gnawed at him. He confided to Sheriff Edwin Blackwood that he feared deliberate harm was being done. The sheriff listened, but proof was scarce. The sect was secretive, and no villager dared testify openly. Still, children went missing. Martha Fenwick, the doctor's young niece, vanished one evening on her way home from the mill. Her bonnet was later found near the foggy road that led to Hollow Fields. The family searched frantically, but Malachi's followers swore they had never seen her. The girl was never found. Inside the sect, the doctrine grew more severe. Fasting was demanded even of children. At night, little ones were lined up in the barn, candles flickering over their pale faces. Malachi would touch each brow, murmuring prayers that spoke of bodies remade by pain. Sometimes he would order small rituals, a cut upon the palm, a burn upon the arm, insisting the marks would guide them closer to heaven. Obadiah Crane's daughter, Charity, bore her scars with pride, though she was but 8 years old. "The angels are bent like me," she once told another child. "They fly with crooked wings." The words chilled even the mothers who believed. Yet whispers spread among the sect itself. Not all were comfortable. Some said infants had been born weak and allowed to die without help. Others murmured of a night when Malachi himself had declared a newborn too whole, too unmarked, and its cries ceased before dawn. But none dared accuse him aloud. Silas's presence was enough to silence doubts, his eyes cold, his knife always near. In Ash Hollow, fear deepened. Villagers avoided the foggy road. Mothers locked their doors at night, holding their children close. They spoke in hushed tones of strange processions, glimpsed in the moonlight lines of robed figures carrying small bundles. Their hymns carried on the wind. No one dared to follow. The breaking point came when Prudence Harker discovered shallow graves near the creek. She had gone searching for herbs and found the earth disturbed, the smell of decay heavy in the air. She unearthed only fragments, tiny bones gnawed by animals, scraps of cloth. Shaken, she fled back to the village, swearing that Hollow Fields had become a cemetery for children. When she confronted Malachi, he did not deny it. He only looked at her with calm, luminous eyes and said, "Blessed are they who suffer in infancy, for they are nearest to God." The midwife left in horror, vowing never to return. But her words were met with silence in town. Some villagers were too afraid. Others secretly wondered if perhaps the preacher was right. For grief has a way of making monsters sound like prophets. And so the children of Hollow Fields became both saints and victims, praised as holy while whispers of sacrifice grew louder. The line between devotion and murder blurred, hidden in fog, sealed in silence. By the winter of 1869, the line between Ash Hollow and Hollow Fields was no longer merely a matter of geography. It was a boundary between fear and fanaticism. The townsfolk had always regarded the sect with unease, but now unease turned to dread. Too many faces were missing from Sunday service. Too many cottages sat abandoned. And at night, when the fog rolled down from the oaks, the voices began again, low, mournful, twisting through the air like smoke. The hymns were not like any psalm known to the churches of Ohio. They were slow, dirge-like, their melodies bending downward as though collapsing under their own weight. From across the fields, farmers swore the songs made their cattle restless, their dogs howl. Ephraim Caldwell claimed he woke one night to hear a chorus calling his name, though when he stumbled to the door, there was no one on the road, only fog and silence. And then there were the processions. Villagers who dared walk near the Hollow Fields path at night spoke of figures moving through the mist, their faces hidden by hoods, their hands clasped around candles that burned with sickly yellow light. At the front walked Silas Quill, tall and gaunt, his eyes catching the glow like coals. Sometimes he carried a wooden cross crookedly nailed together, sometimes a child's toy and offering. Perhaps, though to what no one dared guess, Sheriff Edwin Blackwood grew concerned. He had tolerated the sect so long as they kept to themselves, but disappearances could not be ignored. When Martha Fenwick, the doctor's niece, vanished, Blackwood gathered 2 deputies and rode out toward the farmstead. The fog was so thick their lanterns illuminated only a few feet of road, and each hoofbeat sounded muffled, as if swallowed by the night itself. They found nothing but silence. No torches, no guards. The farmhouse stood still, windows shuttered, the barn looming like a black mouth. Blackwood dismounted and hammered on the door, demanding entrance. When it opened, it was not Thorne who greeted him, but Temperance Blythe, her face pale and serene. "The children are sleeping," she said softly, though behind her the sheriff thought he heard muffled whispers, like a crowd reciting scripture. "There is no one here who does not belong." Blackwood pressed her, demanding to search the grounds. Temperance's eyes glowed with an eerie calm as she replied, To step inside is to step into the fracture. Do you wish to be broken? Sheriff. For a long moment, the man stood frozen, his deputies shifting uneasily, and then the barn door creaked open just a sliver, and Silas Quill appeared, a lantern in his hand. The dim light revealed rows of figures kneeling in the shadows, their faces upturned, their bodies swaying in unison. The sheriff swore later he heard a child's voice among them, crying out, but whether in song or in pain, he could not say. He left without searching further, shaken in a way he could not explain. Back in town, he told Dr. Fenwick only they are too many, too devoted. To move against them now would mean blood. The townsfolk, meanwhile, began to watch from a distance. Farmers, returning late from their fields, saw the glow of bonfires in the woods, strange symbols traced in ash on the snow. Prudence Harker swore she saw Malachi himself standing in the road one evening, though when she blinked he was gone, leaving only the echo of a hymn behind her. Rumors multiplied. Some said they saw the cult carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, small enough to be children, laying them into shallow pits by the creek. Others whispered that Malachi had promised a great revelation, and that soon the town itself would be called to witness. Inside Hollow Fields, the worship grew more frenzied. Malachi preached that persecution was proof of righteousness. They fear us, he told his followers, because we are nearer to heaven than they have ever been. Their hatred is their confession. Silas paced among the congregation, ensuring obedience, while Temperance led women and children in hymns that rose shrill into the night. Obadiah Crane, once timid in his suffering, now thundered his testimony. I walked as a cripple, ashamed. But now I walk as a saint. My limp is my crown. The congregation roared in agreement, though outside the barn, villagers huddled in their beds, hearing his cries as if they were curses. By February, fear had infected Ash Hollow like a plague. Mothers refused to let their children walk alone. Men carried rifles when they ventured near the woods. At night, windows were barred, lamps kept burning. Yet still, the songs drifted on the wind, a reminder that Hollow Fields was only a mile away. Dr. Fenwick pressed the sheriff again. If we do nothing, more children will vanish. They call illness salvation. They carve their own flesh. How long before they demand worse? Blackwood stared into his drink and said nothing. He had seen the fire in their eyes, the kind that made men unafraid of death. To move against them without proof would be to invite slaughter. And besides, part of him feared that the doctor was right, that within Hollow Fields, something far darker than madness had taken root. The town was watching and waiting. But for what, no one knew. Only that each night the fog thickened, and the voices grew louder, and the road to Hollow Fields seemed to lead not to a farmstead, but into the mouth of some ancient, devouring thing. By the spring of 1870, Hollow Fields had become less a community than a fever dream, a place where reality bent beneath the weight of belief. To step into the barn at night was to enter another world, a world where shadows moved like spirits and voices rose in a cadence that no longer sounded human. Outsiders who glimpsed the gatherings described them as processions of the half-dead gaunt faces, scarred arms, eyes glowing with a strange serenity that seemed to defy reason. Within the sect, visions had become the new gospel. Malachi Thorne no longer relied solely on his sermons. He urged his followers to seek revelation through suffering. Open the flesh, he said, and the spirit will open also. The wound is the window, and many claimed they saw through that window sights too terrible, too holy, to be spoken aloud. Mercy Elwood was among the first. During a night of fasting and prayer, she collapsed onto the straw, her body convulsing. When she rose, her eyes were wide and unblinking, her voice a whisper that chilled the room. "I saw them," she said. "The angels of fracture. Their wings were broken, their faces twisted, but they shone brighter than the sun. They sang with voices like shattered glass. Her testimony spread like wildfire through Hollow Fields. Others sought the same vision, starving themselves longer, cutting deeper, enduring hours of sleepless prayer. Soon, many claimed to see them, figures of light bent into monstrous shapes, cherubim with crooked spines, seraphim whose halos were cracked and bleeding. To the faithful, these were proofs of heaven. To the few doubters who remained, they were omens of madness. Obadiah Crane became one of the loudest voices of revelation. "I saw an angel limping as I limp," he proclaimed, thumping his crutch against the floorboards. "And the limp was his glory. He said to me, 'Obadiah, you are nearer to God than the whole world that mocks you.'" The congregation erupted in cries of ecstasy, echoing his words until the barn trembled. Even children were caught in the frenzy. Little Charity Crane, her spine twisted, spoke one night in a voice that seemed not her own. "They are coming," she whispered, "the bent angels, the crooked saints. They will take us home." Her words sent shivers through the room, yet Malachi only smiled, nodding as if the prophecy were his own. To outsiders, the change was unmistakable. Prudence Harker described seeing Mercy Elwood in town, her face pale, her arms hidden beneath long sleeves. Her eyes, the midwife muttered, looked as though they had seen something no human ought to see. She did not blink. She only smiled, as if she pitied me. Ephraim Caldwell reported seeing Jonah Fitch wandering barefoot through the fields, his feet torn and bleeding, yet his expression tranquil, as though pain itself had become his prayer. Dr. Fenwick grew more alarmed. He noted that members of the sect appeared emaciated, their bodies scarred. Yet they moved with eerie calm, speaking of visions as though they were the only reality. He tried to reason with Temperance Blythe when she brought her son Nathaniel into town, feverish and pale. "This boy is dying," Fenwick warned, but Temperance only smiled faintly. "He is nearer now," she whispered, and carried the child back into the fog. Rumors of madness spread. Some said the sect no longer slept at all, that they spent nights swaying in the barn, eyes rolled back, whispering in tongues no villager could understand. Others claimed Malachi had begun to anoint them with ash and blood, declaring them no longer of this world but citizens of a kingdom unseen. Sheriff Blackwood watched from afar, torn between fear and duty. He had seen fanatics before, but never a whole community enthralled by visions. "They do not fear death," he told Fenwick in a low voice. "A man who does not fear death is more dangerous than a man with a rifle." Meanwhile, the sect grew more isolated. They no longer came to town for supplies, living instead on meager crops and what little they could trade in secret. Yet their numbers did not dwindle. Travelers vanished into the fog and never returned. Some said they had been lured, others that they had joined willingly, drawn by whispers of revelation. One farmer's son, curious and reckless, followed the sound of chanting one night. He returned at dawn, white as bone, his eyes wide with terror. He told his father he had seen figures glowing faintly in the barn, their faces twisted in the candlelight, their voices rising in a scream that was not agony but joy. He swore he had seen Malachi himself lifted by the crowd, his arms bleeding, his face radiant, as if crowned by invisible thorns. The boy never spoke again. Within a week, he hanged himself in the loft of his family's barn. For the townsfolk, that was the final proof Hollow Fields was no church. It was a plague of madness, a fever that consumed not only the body but the mind. And still the visions multiplied. Malachi preached that these sights were the heralds of a great transformation. "The world will crumble," he told them, "and only the fractured shall endure. The straight shall break, but the crooked shall remain." His words became the creed of Hollow Fields, a mantra whispered even by children in their sleep. What had begun as comfort for the broken had become an empire of delirium. And as spring turned to summer, Ash Hollow braced itself, for no one doubted now that something catastrophic was coming. The fire began on a night of heavy heat, when the air itself felt thick and restless, as if the land could no longer bear the weight of Hollow Fields. It was late summer of 1869, though by then the sect had ceased to measure time in months or seasons. They lived by fasts, by visions, by the rhythm of pain and prayer. Outside, the fields lay barren, the soil cracked. Inside, the barn was crowded with followers swaying in candlelight, chanting to the fractured angels they believed hovered above. No one knew who struck the first spark. Some later claimed it was an accident, a candle tipped during a fit of frenzy, straw igniting before anyone could act. Others swore it was deliberate, that one among them had decided the world must end in flame. A few whispered it was divine judgment, the hand of God descending upon the heretics. Whatever its cause, the fire spread with unnatural speed. The barn's dry beams caught first, roaring into sudden light. Panic surged through the congregation. Women screamed, children wailed, and men tried to smother the flames with torn cloth. But the fire was already leaping, eating through walls and licking at the rafters. The air filled with smoke and the smell of burning hair, of singed flesh. Sheriff Edwin Blackwood, who had been patrolling the edge of the woods that night, saw the glow first. He spurred his horse into the fog, deputies close behind. By the time they reached Hollow Fields, the fire had spread beyond the barn. The farmhouse smoldered, the sheds were catching, and a column of smoke twisted into the black sky like a signal to heaven. Blackwood shouted for buckets, but the cultists did not fight the fire. Many stood motionless, faces illuminated by the blaze, their eyes wide with something closer to awe than fear. Some sang as the roof collapsed. Others knelt in the dirt, arms raised to the inferno as though it were the very revelation Malachi had promised. The sheriff and his men forced their way into the burning barn, dragging out those they could, but the scene inside was chaos followers stumbling through smoke, clutching relics and scraps of parchment instead of seeking safety. One deputy swore he saw Silas Quill lifting a torch higher, feeding the fire, his gaunt face lit by a fanatic's grin. When Blackwood called his name, Silas vanished into the smoke and was never seen again. By dawn, the blaze had burned itself out. Half the farmstead lay in ashes, the barn reduced to a charred skeleton of beams. Among the debris, the sheriff found fragments of parchment. Their edges blackened, but words still legible. The crooked shall endure. Other scraps bore strange diagram sketches of twisted bodies, wings bent at unnatural angles, halos cracked and bleeding ink. Worse still were the bones. At first, Blackwood thought them animal remains, but the shapes were too small, too delicate. Beneath the collapsed roof they uncovered skeletal fragments of children, scorched beyond recognition. Prudence Harker, who had come with the bucket line, wept as she turned over a tiny rib cage in the ash. "God forgive them," she murmured. "God forgive us for not stopping this sooner." The sheriff searched for Malachi Thorne, but the preacher was gone. No body was ever found, only a blood-stained scrap of his coat near the barn's entrance. Some believed he perished in the fire, consumed along with his writings. Others insisted he had fled into the woods, carried by the chaos into hiding. His absence only deepened the mystery. Of the cultists, many survived. Yet, when Blackwood tried to question them, their words were incoherent. Some spoke in tongues. Others muttered of visions still burning behind their eyes. A few wandered aimlessly, hands blistered, smiles fixed upon their faces as if the fire had not destroyed them but transformed them. One woman, later identified as Mercy Elwood, clutched a half-burned wooden idol to her chest and repeated a single phrase, "The angels were here. The angels were here." She refused food or water, and within days, she was dead. Charity Crane, Obadiah's daughter, was missing. The sheriff found no trace of her among the survivors or the dead. Some claimed she had been carried into the fire itself, offered as the sect's final sacrifice. Others whispered she had walked out of the blaze untouched, following Malachi into the woods. Her absence haunted the town for years. A child lost to smoke and rumor. The surviving villagers of Ash Hollow gathered at the edge of the ruin, staring at the blackened timbers. They whispered prayers, though no church bells rang. Some wanted to dig graves for the bones, but others argued that the sect had forfeited the right to Christian burial. In the end, the sheriff ordered shallow pits dug by the creek, where the remains, half human, half ash, were covered over in silence. That night, the fire still glowed in the earth, embers hidden beneath layers of soot. And though the flames had died, Hollow Fields did not feel empty. Farmers swore they heard singing in the ruins, faint and distant, like voices carried on the smoke. Caldwell claimed he saw a figure standing among the ashes, tall and pale, his eyes catching the last red glow of the coals. When he blinked, the figure was gone. By the following week, the cult itself seemed to vanish. The farmhouse stood hollow. The barns blackened, but no followers remained. Survivors melted away into the countryside. Some were seen wandering barefoot on distant roads, their faces vacant, their arms scarred. Others were never accounted for. Ash Hollow, though relieved, could not shake its unease. For though the fire had destroyed the sect's home, it had not destroyed its hold. In taverns and kitchens, people whispered of Malachi Thorne still alive, of Silas Quill lurking in the woods, of children carried into the blaze and transformed. The hollow fields had burned, but its ashes smoldered with secrets too heavy to bury. Nearly 3 decades passed before the Hollow Fields was spoken of openly again. The fire of 1869 had consumed the farmstead, and though the townsfolk whispered of ghosts and vanished children, time worked its slow erasure. Ash Hollow grew quieter, its younger generation treating the tale as a cautionary legend rather than lived memory. Those who had seen the blaze with their own eyes, Sheriff Blackwood, Prudence Harker, Ephraim Caldwell, went to their graves with secrets unspoken. But the earth remembers what men would rather forget. In the spring of 1897, a group of railroad laborers were sent to clear ground near the old creek bed, where the sect's shallow graves had been dug long ago. Their shovels struck wood first-rotted timbers that splintered at a touch. At first, they thought it nothing but debris from the fire. Then one man unearthed a skull, small as a child's, blackened yet intact. Soon more bones surfaced, fragile and brittle, scattered as though tossed in haste. The men dropped their tools, pale and trembling. Word spread quickly through town the dead of Hollow Fields were rising from the earth. The county coroner, summoned from a nearby city, examined what could be gathered. He counted at least 7 distinct skeletons, though he admitted there were likely more, fragmented beyond recognition. Many were children. Some bore unusual marks, grooves carved into the bone, as though knives had traced symbols long after death. The coroner left shaken, muttering that he had no explanation that would satisfy either science or God. Even more disturbing were the artifacts uncovered beside the remains. Half-burned journals, their pages smeared with soot but words still legible in places, bore Malachi Thorne's jagged script. Phrases repeated again and again: "The straight shall be broken. The crooked shall endure." Drawings filled the margins, sketches of winged figures bent and twisted. Halos cracked like shattered glass. One page described the fire itself not as accident, but as the cleansing flame, the furnace of rebirth. Among the journals was a different hand, the writings of Silas Quill. His script was steadier, his words more precise, yet no less disturbing. He wrote of rituals unspoken in public sermons, infants deliberately starved, children marked with blades to invite the angel's touch, in one entry, dated weeks before the fire. Silas described a vision given to Malachi. He said the barn must burn, that in fire the flesh would be transfigured. He smiled when he told us. He smiled when these fragments reached the desk of Eleanor Winslow, a local historian with a fascination for forgotten tragedies. She set about compiling them into a small pamphlet. She interviewed the last surviving witnesses, farmers who had seen the processions, women who remembered the hymns drifting across the fog. She pieced together a narrative darker than even rumor had suggested. Her pamphlet, The Sect of the Hollow Fields, circulated quietly in Ohio, passed hand to hand in libraries and church basements. It described the cult not merely as deluded, but as intentionally cruel, embracing deformity and suffering as sacraments. Winslow did not shy from the possibility that the fire had been orchestrated, a final ritual rather than catastrophe. The publication reignited old fear. Families who bore names linked to the sect Elwood, Crane, Blythe found themselves whispered about in shops and schools. Children bullied one another, saying crooked spines or limps were the mark of Malachi. Some elders swore they had seen descendants with the same glassy-eyed stare, the same strange serenity, as if the madness had passed through blood. Meanwhile, the excavation continued. More bone surfaced, scattered beyond the original burial pits. Some were charred, others whole. One skull bore a hole bored neatly into the temple, too precise to be an accident of fire. Another had teeth filed into sharp points, as if reshaped by human hand. Workers refused to dig further, demanding the ground be consecrated by a priest before they continued. Even then, many abandoned the site altogether, unwilling to disturb whatever lingered in the soil. Newspapers picked up the story, though most treated it as grotesque curiosity. Ghastly relics of Ohio sect unearthed. One headline read, but beneath the sensationalism, unease spread. Letters to the editor asked whether Hollow Fields had truly ended in 1869 or whether remnants of the sect had survived, carrying on their rites in secret. A farmer north of Ash Hollow claimed he had seen hooded figures in his orchard one night, standing in a circle, their voices low and rhythmic. A traveling salesman swore he met a woman near the railway station who called herself a daughter of the fractured light, her arms striped with scars. Each report was dismissed as drunken fancy or gossip, yet together they painted a picture too familiar to ignore. Eleanor Winslow ended her pamphlet with a chilling conclusion: the Hollow Fields burned. But fire does not destroy faith. It purifies. If Malachi Thorne survived, then so too did his doctrine. And if his doctrine survived, we must ask, where does it live now? Ash Hollow, by then a dwindling town, never fully recovered from the unearthed past. Families moved away. Churches preached sermons of warning. But still, in taverns and on porches, the whispers grew that Malachi's body had never been found, that Silas Quill's writings ended abruptly not with confession but with promise, that the children who vanished were not consumed but carried away. For the land remembers, and the bones beneath it tell a story darker than any man dares admit. By the dawn of the 20th century, Ash Hollow was no longer the thriving farming town it had once been. The railroad bypassed it, trade shifted elsewhere, and the soil itself seemed unwilling to yield. Houses sagged into the earth, barns collapsed, and fields lay fallow beneath weeds. Yet even as the town withered, the story of Hollow Fields refused to die. Children whispered it as folklore, daring each other to walk the foggy road where the sect once gathered. Parents hushed them, but their own eyes betrayed fear. Some swore the ground still smoked in summer, as though embers from the great fire smoldered unseen beneath the soil. Others claimed the air grew colder near the ruins, the fog thicker, the silence heavier. No one lingered there after dusk. And then there were the families, the Elwoods, the Cranes, the Blythes. By blood or by rumor, they were linked to the sect, and suspicion clung to them like a shadow. In schoolyards, children pointed to a limp, a twisted spine, or even a nervous stammer, calling it the mark of Malachi. Some descendants fled, changing names and starting new lives far from Ohio. Others remained, either too stubborn or too poor to leave, enduring generations of whispers. The whispers grew darker in time. In 1912, a farmer's wife claimed she saw a group of cloaked figures kneeling in the ruins, their bodies swaying in rhythm, though no sound reached her ears. In 1924, a traveler passing through swore that an old woman offered him the blessing of the fracture in exchange for a coin. Her arms marked with scars like a ledger. In 1937, 2 children vanished from a nearby village. Search parties scoured the woods, but all they found was a crooked wooden cross nailed into a tree, its base blackened as though by fire. Each event renewed the legend the Hollow Fields Sect had not perished. It had scattered, dissolved into the countryside like smoke. Its embers carried in bloodlines, in secrets, in whispers. Eleanor Winslow's pamphlet, reprinted in the early 20th century, spread the legend beyond Ohio. Historians debated whether the sect had been a unique aberration or simply one more chapter in America's long history of fanaticism. Clergy denounced it from pulpits, warning their congregations of heresy and madness. Yet, for others, the very darkness of the story became alluring. Occultists quoted Thorne's words as scripture. Printing his phrases in underground journals, the straight shall break, the crooked shall endure. Some even claimed to have uncovered more of Silas Quill's writings, though their authenticity was never proven. What unsettled locals most was the persistence of sightings. Even in the 1950s, hunters reported strange fires burning in the woods, where figures gathered around flames, though no tracks were left behind. A truck driver in 1963 swore that a woman in white stepped into the road near the ruins, her face glowing with serene madness, scars visible across her arms. She vanished when he swerved. Through it all, the central question remained what became of Malachi Thorne. His body had never been found, his fate never proven. Some believed he perished in the blaze, reduced to ash with his flock. Others swore he had fled, carrying with him the heart of the doctrine, passing it secretly from disciple to disciple. A few whispered that he was not a man at all, but something older, wearing flesh for a season before retreating into shadow. Sheriff Blackwood once confided, late in his life, that he had seen Thorne after the fire. He claimed the preacher stood among the ashes, untouched, his eyes fixed upon the sheriff with calm recognition. He did not burn. Blackwood told a friend, he did not die. He only waited. The friend dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, but the story lingered all the same. By the late 20th century, Hollow Fields was a ruin of rumor more than earth. Yet hikers and amateur ghost hunters still sought it out, reporting fog that swallowed flashlights, sounds of chanting carried on the wind, the smell of smoke in air that should have been clear. A few returned with photographs, blurred figures, crooked crosses, faint glows at night. Most dismissed them as tricks of light. But those who stood at the site swore they felt something alive beneath the soil, something watching. Today, the story endures in fragments, bones unearthed, journals half burned, names whispered like curses. Historians file it under local hysteria. Folklorists call it legend. But in Ash Hollow, the past is not dead. It waits in fog, in bloodlines, in scars carried silently by those who never chose them. The Hollow Fields Sect is gone, and yet it is not. Its doctrine lingers, neither holy faith nor holy madness, but a fracture between the two. And like all fractures, it spreads. The story of Hollow Fields does not end with fire, nor with bones lifted from the earth. It lingers, unresolved, like a wound that never fully heals. The ruins are overgrown now, buried beneath weeds and time, yet locals still avoid them. Some say you can hear children crying in the fog. Others claim to see figures kneeling in the distance, swaying in rhythm, as though the old hymns still echo in the soil. No historian has ever proven whether Malachi Thorne perished or survived. No one can say whether Silas Quill's final writings were destroyed or hidden away. What is known is that children vanished, bones were unearthed, and families were left forever marked. Beyond that, all is speculation, yet speculation itself is a kind of haunting. What terrifies most is not what we know, but what we cannot dismiss. If faith can sanctify suffering, if madness can masquerade as holiness, then Hollow Fields is not confined to 1869. It is a mirror of what human beings are capable of when desperation seeks meaning at any cost. And that mirror still waits, cracked but unbroken. So the question remains, what do you believe really happened in Ash Hollow? Was the fire the end, or only the beginning? Did the sect die with its children? Or does it breathe still, hidden in backwoods gatherings, in scars passed from parent to child? The truth lies buried, but not gone. Some fractures never close. Subscribe for more stories history tried to erase, and continue watching this video here